Too many alerts and not enough action? It's time to get SaltStack. SaltStack is an intelligent IT automation platform that detects security issues in critical business systems and then actually fixes them. With SaltStack, security and IT teams work together to define custom security policies with certified checks for CIS, DISA-STIGs, and more. You can scan systems for millions of compliance checks in minutes. Remediate compliance and vulnerability issues with powerful automation, all in a single platform. Visit securityweekly.com/SaltStack to learn more. SysDig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using SysDig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. SysDig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using SysDig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/SysDig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We are running two surveys. Currently, one is the 5 stages of automation maturity, and 2, our annual listener feedback survey. So please visit securityweekly.com, click the survey tab, and select 5 stages of automation maturity or 2019 listener survey to submit your responses. The new Security Weekly website is officially live. Visit securityweekly.com to check out all of our new sorting and filtering functionality, including all the nice tabs I was just mentioning in those surveys. Please visit us. Please let us know if you find any issues or have any feedback by sending to website@securityweekly.com or .net. Sorry, my brain is going all over the place. See, Paul's been doing all this great work on the website, so just send Paul an email, let him know what the website looks like.
No, I did all that work. Dang it.
Paul's been doing all that work, and Matt has been doing a lot of work too.
So so people know, right? One of my goals was that you used to read the URLs / whatever, right? And so one of the goals of the new website was to be able to navigate to all those slashes, which is why webcasts, surveys, the sponsor landing pages, you can get to them all from the main menu now. But part of that process of not only streamlining navigation, we really wanted to improve the ability to find content. We've done thousands of segments across all of our shows over the years. And it was hard for people to say, remember that one podcast where we talked to somebody or other? So the other thing we did is for each of the shows, we added in some faceted filters for searching and filtering out content to make it easier to find things on the website. Those also filtering and sorting capabilities work for our blog posts, our articles, as well as the new webcast feed. So that phase is over. We got it released last week. So website at securityweekly.net. We'll send all that to me and Paul and Sam to fix. And our next phase is the member site. So we're getting ready to start working on the member insider site next.
Yeah, that looks good. And it's great to be able to find information about the different podcasts more easily. And there's some great highlighting of those articles look a lot more prominent now on the website too. So that's really cool to see.
Yeah, we tried to unbury everything. So it took a while to kind of sort and recategorize all that old content. I know it's not 100% perfect. So that's why I said, if you guys find something, just let us know. But it's way easier to find stuff now than it was in the past.
Yeah, so there's the instructions. I'll fix the announcement and say, so send that email to website at securityweekly.net. Let Matt know how well he has done with fixing up the website and provide feedback on the Denver Broncos shirt that he wore today. It's very orange.
Nice and bright.
I don't have a good segue for this. Shoot, I did think of a good one for nice and bright, because this is sort of the bad and dark, I suppose, leading off with some insider threat aspects. So right in our previous segment, I made just a quick reference to, having credentials is one of the best ways into an organization, best ways to compromise an application. One of the either we can call it best, but more, impactful or more difficult even to prevent is that malicious insider. And we had two articles here, one about an ex-Yahoo engineer who was using his privileged access to get into about 6,000 user accounts, email accounts, and then using that access to both look for nudes, look for pictures. Also, since it's email is the great way to get access to other accounts, because that is where password resets go to, or click this link to log in. So there's also a way to once you have access to an email account, broaden that elsewhere. And the other insider attack was American Express. And an insider was getting access to cardholder information. So we have two very different motivations here. One about personal access, getting access to personal data that can both lead to just extortion, blackmail, just outright trolling, embarrassment, and the other getting access to data that is also financially relevant. So those were the two big things that stood out to me in terms of breaches this week.
Yeah, and we didn't cover this much on the last segment, but identity and access, authentication, privileged access, I mean, these are all things that fell down in this particular case. I think in this particular case, both of these insiders had privileged access into the systems that wasn't removed when they were not employed anymore. And if we think about where some of these insider attacks are, it's when insiders have privileged access and or credentials haven't been removed when they've left the organization, which leave these backdoors in. And identity is a big part of the future, where I think there's a lot more innovation yet to come, and a better way to help us manage how people gain access to this data, because we've seen multiples of these over the past few months and through this year of these insiders kind of getting attacked. Capital One is the same way, right? It was a former insider that got access into a backdoor and then got around the system. So this is a really important part of organization security posture, and sometimes we forget about that identity access and privileged access in the organization.
And there's also that angle too about, as you're describing, having that strong identity, strong access, minimizing privileges so that you're only exposing the minimum data necessary to conduct that particular customer support, account support type of function. But there's also critically a auditing capability that should be present within these organizations. And so in the case of that ex-Yahoo engineer, they went to work at a different company. Company discovered this and said, whoa, we need to make sure that their access hasn't been abused in the same manner. And they were able, they got a third party to come in, which I think was smart, just to help build the confidence. But they actually had the ability to be able to review that because they had auditing capability, they had monitoring, logging. And that's a lot more comfortable position to be in, as opposed to say, well, sure, we did everything up right with having this strong multi-factor authentication, but we have no idea who accessed what, when, and how. So being able to answer what the scope of that, call it insider compromise is a great step, and speaks to what we're also talking about that last segment, that logging and monitoring is a very important thing. Do that early, do that often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And the motive for both of these attacks are different. I mean, one is broad kind of fraud, credit card, social security numbers, everything. Right. The Yahoo one was much more targeted. I think it was very blackmailish type of attack. He was going after people he knew, friends of friends. I think he was using this as a potential blackmail campaign, where the other one is a much broader kind of fraud attack, which is interesting because motives also change the attack technique a little bit, potentially, because if you're not trying to scrape as many credit cards and social security numbers to sell on the dark web or use as part of a campaign, the techniques might be a little different than a more targeted attack in the case of Yahoo, but both used privileged access and old credentials to be able to get in, which is the same.
Yeah. I think, John, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just back to the previous segment, one of the things I thought of here, I think it's either for a small company or a big one. One of the things to really keep in mind is checklists, right? Either for, again, me and my 3 o'clock in the morning thing, or you're principal developer just told you he's leaving on Friday. Either way, you need to be able to react quickly, right? And it's the same thing in flying or anything else. You can't depend upon the brain at those sort of times to be able to remember everything you should do. So you have a checklist you can go through saying, okay, have I locked the account here? Have I done this? Have I done that? Have we cleared everything up? Do we need to bring in a third party and actually have that list? So if you can think about it now and, you've got time while you're, instead of, I don't know, watching TV, spend 5 minutes with a piece of paper on the couch, that can be really handy down the road. Or, hey, better yet, if you can Google around and find these things, someone's done it before, probably.
Exactly. And the other reason to have that checklist is you don't want to be making these decisions or trying to figure out that checklist under pressure. It's the same thing with an incident response. When you find out inevitably that S3 bucket has been misconfigured and it's wide open, scrambling to figure out what should we do, how should we respond, do we just delete everything? Do we delete our access logs, or do we have access logs, or how do we get this just to do that? Forensics investigation is pretty important. So going in with a calm and a structured approach checklist is a great help. And I think go ahead.
I think it's sort of one of the weaknesses in really software engineering in general, particularly InfoSec. I'm getting back into flight training recently, and as you know, the amount of pretty much anytime something bad happens, right? You've usually got recordings of the air traffic controller, of what's going on the plane, all these different things. So there's a ton of examples to pull from of like, the plane trying to land on a wrong runway, or once it's landed, air traffic controller saying, hey, turn left, and the pilot's like, I can't turn left here, there's a plane coming at me. But I think a lot of those things we can learn from as individuals, but I wish there was a lot more of that in the InfoSec world of like, we got compromised, this is why, this is what happened. If we had done these 3 things, we would have been a lot safer, or we had a checklist, we missed one, or, I think there's a lot of learning we can do from others.
Yeah, and I've heard that too. I think I want to say Chris Weissapol, or maybe it's Chris Eng. One of the guys from Veracode, I didn't think have been talking about like that idea of we don't have like an NTSB equivalent for InfoSec. We've seen a couple things in the past where Twitter has publicly said, hey, we're going to let everyone know that we accidentally logged some plain text passwords into some log files. Here's a mistake. This is why we're rotating some passwords. I think Facebook, Google, Microsoft have all done some similar things where they've come out and say publicly, hey, look at this really bad security mistake we made. We're explaining what happened, and here are the steps we took. And these things happen even to, these massive teams that are well financed. And you can see this also too in other public blog posts that other companies have been putting up in response to other types of breaches. So I'm struggling to find more than those, I think, 5 or 6 anecdotes over the last 2 or 3 years. So we're clearly not very far along this route. But it's at least good to see that there's a little bit of a movement, as well as I suspect a lot of appetite for sharing more of this type of information to say, yep, malicious insiders are a problem. And kind of what Matt was alluding to as well, there's a big difference in detecting, what's the UBA, the behavior analytics industry. It's a lot easier to say someone's scraping or pulling down, a couple million records of credit card data, probably a lot more anomalous than someone poking around at maybe a few hundred of their friends and acquaintances or exes' accounts. So these are really interesting things to be thinking about. But shifting then from those types of human-centric attackers, there are 2 other very technical items that I wanted to pull out this week. One was a really cool write-up about the double free bug in WhatsApp. So I've dropped this into more of our learning section rather than talking about yet one more breach, though it's not to say it's not consequential to basically receive a GIF via your messaging in WhatsApp and then have that be a remote RCE or for an RCE to compromise your system. But what was really neat about this is that the write-up for it is nicely detailed, even going into how to bypass what would be normally strong, good controls like ASLR and writable or write-only or write or execute types of pages. So I wanted to highlight these for reading for our listeners. I'm not quite sure there's too much we would dive into that one, or the other one that is about the flare-on CTF. So Malware Unicorn, she is a pretty well known on Twitter, does some great work in terms of reverse engineering. She wrote up for the FireEye Labs. They run their advanced research engineering team, runs a CTF. And Malware Unicorn wrote a great walkthrough of how to solve the CTF. So you get some really great pointers, not only in what the Flare-On challenge was designed to do, is present a lot of very Windows-centric problems in this case, but step into the mind of a reverse engineer and see, look, I think she went through a dozen different tools and even dove into one. There was an NES ROM that they had to reverse engineer. I think her phrase was, well, once you know some assembly, all assembly looks the same, which to a degree is kind of true. That kind of avoids the hard point that, like, you have to get to the point where you're understanding assembly. So that's no small feat right there.
Let's see, that was 1995, I think, for me, the last time I touched an assembler. So yeah, my skills are a little rusty there.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, wait, peek and poke were Commodore 64. And I know there's like rotate left, rotate right, but my assembly is going to fall down pretty quickly. But for those of you with that appetite for diving into some really fun reverse engineering challenges, and you don't need to actually be very super skilled in assembly, I would say check that out. And as an aside too, we've also mentioned in the past Azaria Labs if you want to learn about ARM assembly. So there's a lot of really great resources out there to get really into the depths, if you will, of software and reverse engineering it.
Yeah, I think the interesting one for the WhatsApp one was the two attack vectors, right? It was a local privilege escalation and a remote code execution. So it had two attack paths, which was kind of interesting. Typically, you see one or the other, but having both of them available is kind of interesting in this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those scary aspects that in the one of the scenarios that if you were already someone's contact within WhatsApp, then WhatsApp would automatically interpret the GIF and basically trigger this double free. So you basically had an animated GIF that said something like, here's a GIF with 100 bytes, here's one with 0, and then actually here's another one that's 0, and that would trigger the double free. So it's a really, it's a nice explanation of how that problem goes, but it's one of those really big worries that the recipient doesn't really need to necessarily click on anything. It doesn't need a user interaction to get it. So it's one of those things that it was great that was found, great that was reported through Bug Bounty program, and we've got a great write-up for it.
Very detailed.
Coming up to the other side of the spectrum then. So I pulled out two other things under our food for thought. So there's one aspect of 5 trends that are, shaping the future of container security. And, I'm not sure that all 5 of them are quite the most either very surprising, but yeah.
Paul and I covered this on Enterprise Security Weekly last week, and we really boiled this down to 2 points, 4 and 5. Point 4 says container security is shifting both left and right. And when you think about that, that's true. You have aspects of container shifting to the left as part of the build process, doing the binary software composition analysis, binary injection, et cetera. And then on the right side, at the runtime side. So John and I are extremely familiar with this, having been at Layered Insight, where we were handling container security both at the left and right-hand side of the equation. And that encompasses a couple of the other points above. But what I think is more interesting is point 5, where containers are facilitating, fueling the shift to Cloud 2.0. And the question is, how do you define Cloud 2.0? Cloud 2.0 to me is a move away from dedicated infrastructure in the cloud. I think of Cloud 1.0 as I took my data center servers and I moved them to Amazon as dedicated EC2 instances. Okay. What I think Cloud 2.0 is we're not moving stuff to dedicated EC2 instances anymore. We're starting to migrate stuff to true platform as a service capabilities, right? Whether that's ECS or EKS from a container perspective, whether it's Lambda for functions, whether it's Fargate as true container as a service, what we're seeing containers allow us to do is not have to bring along the rest of the underlying infrastructure with us. I don't have to bring the network. I don't have to bring the host. I don't even have to bring the orchestrator. I can go straight up to an ECS, a EKS, or even higher up in Fargate and abstract all that away. That's the real shift that's happening. And when that happens, it changes how you approach security in the cloud. Again, I did a session with Paul about 3 weeks ago on Enterprise Security Weekly on where are some of the things you have to think about from a security perspective at those different layers in the cloud, depending on how you deploy. That's where I really think these trends, points 4 and 5, are really driving the market. The other ones are just kind of byproducts of 4 and 5.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And that aspect of we're no longer just managing, it's not running your own instance on someone else's, hardware, which, I think that's sort of what you're describing as like cloud 1.0 and 2.0 is now that we're abstracting more. So I'm curious too, how we would approach that from like threat modeling. You were kind of saying that our security models or security ideas are changing because it sounds like more now we care about identity and access management and configuration management. And those are still, they're somewhat abstracted, and they're to a degree abstracted enough that we could describe them in code. But that's where it's important to focus on. That's where security in that middle spot needs to make sure that someone's paying attention, someone is making sure it's well designed, and we can really just, what you were saying, not even care about that network level, hardware level, and so on, because these systems are just going to talk to each other, and I just want, for example, some place to run my code, and that's all I really care about.
Right, and so app user data play in here. And I think, a lot of it starts with identity. We talked about identity access, privilege access, multi-factor authentication. Those are important. They're important at the application layer, and they're important at the API layer because you're going to see a lot of APIs in this cloud 2.0 world because we're interfacing with other services that are out there, and we're leveraging those, right? So that is a huge chunk that I think just has to be addressed. And one of the first slides I covered on the ASW segment, and we could always do it over here too and have an interesting discussion. Then when you break down to the application, it depends on how that application is being deployed, right? Are you Lambda functions? That has a set of requirements. Are you container running in ECS, EKS, or in Fargate? They'll have some different components there, right? And so those are all the different nuances. And it changes the threat model, as you said, Mike, because now the attack vector is coming from the user and or the application, not necessarily from the network or the underlying host necessarily. At least you don't hope so. We haven't seen those attacks where the cloud providers that are running those infrastructure, that's not where the attacks are coming from. The attacks are coming from a misconfigured S3 bucket that gets them in, and then they can pull out data, or another configuration that allows them to traverse sideways through the environment and get data out. That's your kind of typical attack vector. And that means the way we have to approach security in these environments is definitely different. We're not throwing agents on a box. We're not throwing, network sensors in the network anymore. That stuff's been abstracted out in the cloud.
Yeah, I think a little. Oh, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say quickly, it's funny because I think about it a little differently. I think a lot of the points Matt's making are cogent, but at the same time, from a pure application security point of view, the way I think of it is the circle of trust has actually become smaller. Whereas in a more legacy world, I would trust the server I'm on. I would trust the database. I was just interviewing someone last week, and they had drawn this beautiful architecture out on the board, and so one of the questions asked is okay, well, that database there, what do you think about? I was trying to get him to talk about input standardization, or what would he do there. It's oh no, we trust the database. Okay, fine. That's a decision sometimes companies make. If it's in the database, it's secure. It hasn't been tampered with, or it's not going to tamper with us. But as you make that scope becomes smaller and smaller, you have to trust things around you less and less. So either, I would say, at least think about, are you going to write temporary files, or are those temporary files safe to be read back? APIs, when you get an API result from the call from someone else, do you trust that? Do you have to sanitize it more, or do you have to inspect it closer? So I think there's still things within the application that now you have to be, it's the same word, a lot less trusting, right, of people who you're talking with, people or things.
Yeah, I agree with you, John, right? It is a trust issue because we're abstracting away things we used to trust. We used to trust the server we ran on. That server, we don't have control over it anymore. How do you trust it? You're using a new service like RDS for your database. Is it configured correctly? Do I trust that it hasn't been tampered with for the data that's coming back to my application to analyze? These are all intertwined, I think, as we think about how we're deploying and abstracting away certain layers that we used to trust.
Yeah, and that's why I would like to pull in like that. There's a third one I'd like to pull in a little bit more prominently than points 4 and 5 that you were highlighting, Matt, about that idea of that security mesh within service mesh, in the sense of we've definitely moved beyond like trusting the host or host-to-host trust or host-to-host identity, and moved into service-to-service identity. And that's where we have hopefully like mutual authentication versus whether it's TLS and certs, or it's IAM within the native cloud provider scenarios. And that's where, to a degree, this service talking to this RDS service, and that communication and identity is strongly enforced. There is still that aspect that you were just rightly pointing out, John, that maybe we've lost a little bit of control, I think is another way to put it, of the underlying host. But I think that's also a good thing in the sense of we now have dedicated teams that are on top of making sure that host and the operating system level is fully patched. It has a lot of the major kernel advantages of seccomp BPF, a lot of isolation, a lot of capability models. So we're basically moving into an area that everything is going to be multi-tenancy. And possibly I'm being a little bit more optimistic than I should be, but we're worrying less about who our peers are on the multi-tenancy and just saying, what are the resources I'm consuming? And are these my resources only, such as writing in temporary files or writing into environment variables? Or what other services have access to my resources? And is it because I have an API that I need to give other companies, other APIs access to it? Or because I have overly permissive IAM model and I just by accident been, let my API talk to others? And what I'm getting at there is it's not so much the API is talking, that API is serving data or providing access to data. So that where your data lies, that's what we're really trying to focus on. So if I'm trying to say that succinctly, I think we're worrying less about here's how I'm going to harden this host, and here's how I'm going to harden the access around my data, which I think is kind of an appropriate trajectory to take.
So sorry, I like where you went with that towards the end. The beginning, the actual bullet in there, what was number 3? Yeah. Security mesh within service mesh.
Really? So this is where I had a problem with point number 3 is, first of all, what is going on with the service mesh? It was, the rave thing a year ago at KubeCon, but security mesh within a service mesh, I'm not quite sure that that's real. I think there might be people trying to figure out how to embed security meshes into their service meshes if they can figure out what the hell a service mesh is. But I don't think that's the trend driving. I think that's somebody trying to figure out, can I even make it work, let alone it being a trend? I think the other two trends are more of what's driving it. I think point 3 is a catch up. I even think point 2, where security policy as code is becoming a reality. Yeah, it's because we're defining everything as code as part of our CI/CD pipeline. Again, it's because of the adoption of containerization and what it gets me from an agility perspective and where I can deploy. I see this as a byproduct of some of this. Anyways, but this whole service mesh thing still is like befuddles me.
Yeah, so
it's definitely still a sandbox under the CNCF. So I think you've got some support from that perspective. Yeah.
That's an interesting way to think of it. I've been talking with folks here and there over the last few months because it was the sexy thing for 2017 and 18 was service mesh, and it just sort of went off into the little quiet space. And the best we can gather is as people started using it, they realized that the latency is a lot more than they thought it would be. So I suspect that's going to improve over time, but I think people sort of they jumped into that one a little bit too quickly. It looked really cool, but not quite ready to do what a lot of folks wanted it to do. I think that's just my guess.
Think of scalability and performance and latency when you overlay a mesh into a highly distributed environment, and then you try to throw security in there. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm going to one more, because I think the first bullet point I think was actually, honestly, sitting where I am, I have to say it. I think that's probably the strongest of the list. Very seldom do I hear about attacks against containers, right? When's the last time you heard someone say, hey, this container was compromised? You're hearing Kubernetes was compromised, or someone left, your Docker host TCP open, or blah, 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 blah. I think that's really where a lot of the stuff is happening. And that just comes down to hygiene, right? And we've been talking about configuration management a lot here today, but that's where a lot of the sort of the compromises I'm hearing about are coming from, is down at that layer.
Yeah, and that's because containerization's pushing things left and right means I may have a Kubernetes cluster that's running over here that I haven't configured correctly. It also could be an ECS EKS instance in Amazon that I also haven't configured correctly either.
Yeah, so there's a great back.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a great write-up in Kubernetes on their GitHub. They have a working group for security audit, and they posted back at the end of June this year. They posted a threat model from Trail of Bits, and in it, it's got some great findings. It's basically, what would we do to attack Kubernetes? Where does Kubernetes kind of where are some weaknesses that could use some extra attention? And to bolster, I think what you guys were talking about, that security mesh, is they did comment about there's a lot of communication going on between all of the clusters and the nodes within it. Not all of them are using the best TLS, but that's, to get into, there's a lot of hurdles that you need to reach before you can get in to break the security, or that the weaknesses of the TLS within these clusters becomes a real problem. It's more a matter of what they were highlighting is that basically the default configuration and the baseline configuration were really, is unsurprising as that may seem, that's the thing to worry about. And that's not even something that's necessarily a artifact specifically of Kubernetes itself. But it's a great report and something to read into that I'd recommend.
And then you allow a privileged container to run on the environment that gains root access to the underlying Kubernetes cluster. And because it's misconfigured, it allows it to spread everywhere. So root's the other problem too, but that's a fun other discussion.
And that checks off that bingo square for this week as well. Thank you, Matt. Don't give up root.
Just stop it.
So there was one final thing that we could look at. I pulled out the common pitfalls of security monitoring. And since we're getting near the end of the segment, but since we were talking about monitoring in the last segment so much, and a little bit here as well, just wanted to draw some attention to it. Not so much in the sense of this was really focusing on firewall as an example of monitoring. A pitfall in monitoring, but the idea of what do you consider an incident? And an incident isn't always just S3 bucket. S3 bucket has been open, or here is a cross-site scripting, or here's a SQL problem. Incidents could still be, insider threats, as we were talking about earlier this segment. But incidents could also just be pure. Think of them as engineering problems. You have an outage. You have your disk space has filled up. Do you have monitoring that is available and accessible when those scenarios happen? So I think that is one of the aspects of this that I would one of the takeaways I would probably highlight more about this particular article.
Yeah, and it's having the resources in place to understand, is the vulnerability in generic terms, and that could be a CVE or a misconfiguration. Does it have active exploits or threats against it in the wild? Because if it does, it's a potential incident. And then you have to measure it across your infrastructure to see where it is, to really understand the importance of that combination of vulnerability and threat actor or threat vector to determine how to do it. And sometimes that gets hard to do, right? I mean, you don't have the resources, or which is one piece, or you don't have the right data elements, pulling them together to really understand where those intersections happen. And then even if you do identify that potential incident or threat that's out there, well, then what, right? Do I have a process in place that allows me to figure out who's the right person to potentially close the vulnerability so that we don't get the incident? So, there's a lot of pieces at play here.
I worked with the author of this, Aaron, in a previous life, so I'm happy to see he's sort of agreeing with what we were talking about in the last segment around monitoring and those type of things too. Hope he's doing well.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. Hope all of our listeners are doing well as well. And we thank you once again for joining us. Thanks to Matt. Thanks to John. We're going to see you next week on Application Security Weekly.